Well, look who decided to come back. Welcome to episode 2 of Modern World History. I'm Stephanie Edmonds, creator of Teaching Liberty and your host of this Modern World History series. And in today's episode, we're going to begin our journey back in time to the year 1450, to the very beginning of the modern era. But first, let's review what we did in episode 1. But before that, I'm going to need for you to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and click that notification bell so you don't miss any of my videos. Great, now that we've taken care of that, let's review what we went over in episode 1. I gave you an overview of the series and some tips to maximize your learning. So make sure you have those pens and notebooks out. And then we ended by thinking about history itself and our own role in shaping our understanding of history based on our own experiences and identity. In the first place, the facts of history never come to us pure, since they do not and cannot exist in a pure form. They are always refracted through the mind of the recorder. It then follows that when we take up a work of history, our first concern should be not with the facts which it contains, but with the historian who wrote it. Put simply, you must study the historian before you study the facts. And we're going to build and expand on this concept throughout the series, as well as use it as a springboard in this video to dive into history and set the scene for what the world was like around 1450. I mean, 1450, can you imagine what it was like to live in 1450? They had no electricity, let alone phones, computers, cars, all the things that we've become so accustomed to living with. Life was just so wildly different. It's hard to even begin to imagine. Another E.H. Carr quote I often turn to from that same chapter in his book, What is History?, goes like this. History cannot be written unless the historian can achieve some kind of contact with the mind of those about whom he is writing. For example, if you lived during the 19th century and you were taught to believe that it was righteous to kill in the name of your country, but wrong to kill in the name of your religion, it would be difficult for you to enter the mind of somebody living in the 1600s, fighting in the 30 Years' War in the name of religion. So the objective of the assignment I gave you at the end of episode 1 was for you to take stock of who you are and how you see the world so you can remove yourself from that bias and attempt to see the world through the eyes of people throughout history. I'm not looking for you to sympathize with them or to agree with them, but to try and understand their motivations so we can piece together what happened to the greatest extent possible. And hopefully in doing so, we can learn something about ourselves here in the present. Now, with that in mind, over the next 4 episodes, we're going to take a tour around the world in the year 1450. Well, technically, this episode is more like the pre-tour. You know, the part where you're standing outside the trolley and they're reading off all the rules, like keeping your arms and legs inside the vehicle at all times? Yeah, that's this part. Except in this case, I'm going to be giving you a general overview of the world at this time, trends, and the technologies that fueled the modern era. In the next episode, we will officially depart and begin our tour around the world in the year 1450 with East Asia and the South Pacific. In the following episode, our world tour will take us to Western Asia, including the Indian subcontinent and the Middle East, to Africa, then up to Siberia and Russia, and then all the way over to the Americas. And finally, we will complete our world tour with Europe. To put together this world tour, I relied on a number of sources, but in particular, I relied on this book right here. The Human Web, A Bird's Eye View of the World by J.R. and William H. McNeill. As always, all of my sources will be listed in the show notes, which is linked in the description down below. As I talked about in episode 1, to enhance your learning experience, you're going to want to take some notes. For guided notes and other learning activities that go with this episode, become a member at TeachingLiberty.org. Either way, get out your notebooks and pens and let's go. And to begin, I'm going to read you an excerpt from The Human Web. Chapter 5, Spinning the World Wide Web, 1450 to 1800. It begins, as of 1450, the 350 to 400 million people on the face of the earth spoke several thousand languages, followed several hundred religions, and recognized several hundred political rulers. Although a few million people recognized no rulers at all. Despite the effects of 4 millennia of civilization, portable and proselytizing religions, and empire building, humankind was not, in any deep sense, a community. Tremendous diversity still prevailed, and 60 to 120 million people in Oceania, the Americas, and Central and Southern Africa lived almost completely isolated from the main theater of history in Asia and Europe. But as mentioned, right around 1450, the world began to dramatically change and became far more interconnected and more socially, culturally, religiously, linguistically homogeneous or similar. And it is this time period that most historians point to as the birth of the modern age. This transition was made possible by the emergence of new technologies. Perhaps most important were gunpowder warfare, the fully rigged ship, and the Guttenberg Press. Let's take a closer look at each of these, beginning with gunpowder warfare. Gunpowder was invented in China by the 900s and traveled west across the Silk Road to Europe in the 1200s. By the early 1300s, Europeans had developed hollow, cylindrical barrels capable of firing spherical projectiles. By the mid-1300s, early cannons firing stone balls became an important siege weapon. By the early 1400s, gunpowder technology was incorporated into portable, handheld ballistic weapons. These were the forerunners of all subsequent types of small arms and rifles. This increased firepower also led to transformations in tactics on land and at sea. The most effective armies combined their new mobility and firepower with the use of older technologies and techniques such as pikes, bows, and cavalry charges. Ultimately, this increase in firepower and mobility fueled the growth of expansive states with large administrative bureaucracies with an ever-growing power to tax a larger and larger portion of their populations. This more or less continuous warfare set in motion the conditions for the nation-state system we have today. Another piece of technology that multiplied the power and reach of states around the year 1450 was the emergence of the fully rigged ship in Europe. In the southwestern region of France, sailors had introduced the carvel ship, which had 3 masts and both square and lateen sails. Meanwhile, in northern Europe, they used the clinker ship. Right around 1450, these technologies combined, and the fully rigged ship emerged with its 3 masts, with both square and triangular lateen sails, a long hull, and a deep keel. The square sails provided power, while the lateen made the ship more maneuverable. The increased carrying capacity and range of these vessels, combined with their newfound firepower, would carry Europeans on voyages across oceans and ultimately around the world to become the dominant world power of the modern era. Another big one is printing. The Chinese had invented block printing as early as 200 AD, and then the technology was transferred west along the Silk Road. But in 1450, a man named Johannes Gutenberg revolutionized this idea by combining the movable type with a pressing mechanism to create the Guttenberg Press. Around the same time, paper had also made its way over from China, making what once took hours to copy by hand possible in minutes. While reading and writing were once activities limited to the church and government officials, now everyday people could use it as a means of communication and to spread ideas across a distance. The impact of the printing press was far-reaching, from religion to science to government and beyond. As you may have noticed, all 3 of these technological advancements occurred in Europe. However, you may have also noticed that 2 out of 3 of these technologies can trace their roots back to technologies that were initially developed in the East. For example, China is the initial inventor of gunpowder and printing. And while European shipping was more of a natural evolution of the intensive shipping happening along the Mediterranean, China had superior ships until around the 1800s when the Europeans finally caught up. Indeed, during the medieval period, Europe seemed to lag behind the rest of the world. But in the modern era, these technologies would catapult them to be the world's dominant power. As we will find out on the very first stop of our 1450 world tour, China had lurched ahead of the rest of the world starting around the year 1000 to become the dominant power by 1450. But right around that time, for various political and social reasons, they cut themselves off from the rest of the world, leaving an opening for Europe. And this opening came just at the time when Europe was beginning to benefit from the export of knowledge that had been occurring over the past several hundred years from the East to the West. Moreover, beginning in 1450, we see the pendulum of power begin to swing from the East with China over to the West with Europe, which goes a long way for helping us understand why the West comes to dominate the modern era. So over the next 3 episodes, as we take a tour of the world in 1450, and just as importantly throughout the entirety of this series, I want you to keep these trends at the forefront of your mind. For as we delve into history and into people's lives and try to understand their motivations, these are among some of the most powerful forces in shaping and bending people's lives. And as with each episode, I want to leave you with an assignment. I want you to compare and contrast the world in 1450 with the world today. How are they similar? How are they different? What are the demographics like? Population size? How many religions are practiced? How many governments or rulers are recognized? How connected are we now versus how connected were we then? What are the driving forces behind these demographic changes? In 1450, I pointed to technology being the driving force. Is technology still the driving force today? Or is it something else? I want you to identify those forces and explain their impacts. And finally, I want you to identify the center of power. Is it still in the West? Or is it somewhere else? For the complete lesson plans and learning materials that go with this video and every video in the series, become a member of the Teaching Liberty community over at TeachingLiberty.org. And what's so cool about it is beyond the traditional lesson plans and learning materials, you get a community, the Teaching Liberty community. And we have a group in our discussion area dedicated to discussing this series, and I do live Q&As about once a month or so to answer your questions. Plus, by becoming a member, you help support me make more content just like this. Again, all that information is over at TeachingLiberty.org under the community tab. While you're over there, be sure to check out the store for cool t-shirts and sweatshirts. The easiest way to support, however, is to smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, tap that notification bell, and share this video with your friends. And listen, we're just getting started. Buckle up, keep your arms and legs inside the vehicle at all times. Next episode, we take off on our 1450 world tour.